I'm not going to try and convince you who you should vote for. You've probably already decided. But I do think it's important that you understand the tax policies of the two different sides. They will almost certainly affect you, and at least then you'll understand what's on the table for the future. This is going to be a series, and we're going to cover these 7 topics. But the goal isn't to convince you which side is right, but instead give you an understanding of what the experts think of these policies and how they may impact you and the economy. Let's start with no tax on tips. Now, Trump originally had the idea for no tax on tips, but Harris quickly adopted it for a campaign. We'll talk about that in a minute. If you ask economists what they think about this, you're almost universally going to be told that it is not a good idea. And I think the best example of that was from a Wall Street Journal article where they give the example of you tip your Uber Eats and Uber driver or Grubhub driver, but you don't tip your UPS delivery person or your postal carrier. These are all delivery people, either food people or packages, but only some of them receive tips. So why are we arbitrarily giving a tax cut to some of them and not other ones? Similarly, this would kind of dramatically change the way that we would try and pay people. If there's a way that we can pay people so that they're not taxed, then we would try and shift that way, and the already absurd tipping culture that we have, in the direction it's going here in the US would probably get substantially worse. But I think the side that people aren't discussing is the history around taxation and tips. Now, by the books, tips have always been taxed. But in practice, 30 years ago, back in the 90s when I worked for tips were almost always paid in cash, and thus a lot of tips would not be declared. Now, I of course would never do this, but in practice, cash tips were often not taxed. And then the digital payment revolution comes along, and now we've almost certainly moved to tips are tracked through all the payment systems, and we certainly pay taxes on them now. So there's definitely an era of this where we've kind of gone from, in practice, not taxing tips to taxing almost all tips. And I think what ultimately wins out is how little of the population this would affect, and even how little of them would see a benefit from it. So the statistics around this are that about 3% of the population would see a dramatic impact from this, and of that 3%, 30% of them already don't pay any federal income tax. So this is going to affect a very small percentage of the population in a very arbitrary way. Of course, so why are we proposing it? Well, Nevada is an important swing state. Vegas, Reno, a lot of Nevada is paid through tips. And this is really kind of seen as a kind of populist movement in trying to buy Nevada, which is probably why Harris quickly adopted the policy as well, as she saw I could lose Nevada if I don't, kind of go along with this as well. I think a better policy, if we want to help tipped workers, is instead to raise the federal minimum wage for tipped workers, which is a laughable $2.13. It was ridiculous when I earned it in the 90s. It's even more ridiculous now. Now, most states already have a taxed minimum wage higher than that, but it would go a long way and probably have a better impact for the most disadvantaged tipped workers. Now, before we move on with the rest of the series, I think it's important to address the fact that both candidates are heavily criticized for speaking in general themes and not giving specific policy agendas. But look at it this way. In his first term, Trump learned that one of his biggest hurdles was going to be his own party. And if Harris gets elected, it's probably not going to be any different. Similarly, the president doesn't establish tax policy. Congress does. And neither candidate knows who's going to be in charge in Congress. How does a presidential nominee give a specific policy agenda when they don't even know who the decision makers are going to be? Now, the next video in the series is going to talk about no tax on Social Security. It'll be right here in a couple of days. Stick around the channel for similar content, and I will talk to you soon.